Major offensive operations of the armed forces of Ukraine blockaded Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions after the special forces of the Ukrainian army besieged the city of Orikhiv and Zaporizhia from two different directions. They turned their offensive axis towards the northeast of the city, while the 110th Defense Brigade and the 102nd Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian army were carrying out violent offensive operations in the southeast of Orikhiv. It was claimed that the Russian reinforcements from the direction of Kamyansk-Dniprovsky advanced over the city of Zapovednik to support Orikhiv. However, the Kamyansk-Dniprovsky direction where the Russian reinforcements wanted to advance was a risky front line, where the counterattack actions of the Ukrainian army were very intense. A convoy of military vehicles from the 83rd Brigade of the Russian Air Force took all the risks due to the critical situation in Orikhiv and proceeded on its route towards the Zaporizhia region to reach Orikhiv via Zapovednik. In this critical area, the White Wolves, one of the most special units of the Ukrainian army, managed to stop the convoy of the 83rd Brigade of the Russian Air Force near the Zapovednik settlement. After fierce clashes, the Russian convoy was almost destroyed by the Ukrainian special team, the White Wolves. Russian weapons in the convoy were completely destroyed. Following the successful attacks by the White Wolves, special units of the Ukrainian army, the Russian military convoy could not reach Orikhiv. Therefore, a critical front line in the northeast of Orikhiv also lacked the military support of the Russian army. Realizing the situation, the special units of the Ukrainian army took action at the same time that Ukrainian special forces called the White Wolves stopped the Russian military convoy in Zapovednik. The Ukrainians were conducting an incredible offensive operation in Storozheva, southwest of Velika Novosilka. In other words, the Zaporizhia region was on fire. The simultaneous offensive operations of the Ukrainian special forces on the front lines of this region seriously increased the tension in Storozheva. The soldiers of Russia's 60th Motor Brigade were trying to resist critical attacks by the 108th Defense Brigade and 128th Regional Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. However, with Ukraine's 68th Jaeger Brigade, which came to support from the northeast lines of Storozheva, the Russians began to get trapped in the city parallel to the route where the 68th Jaeger Brigade of the Ukrainian Army came. That is east of Storozheva. The 37th Motorized Brigade of the Russian Army was located. However, against three special forces from the Ukrainian Army, the Russian Army was able to send only two military special forces to the city of Storozheva. The numerical superiority was on the Ukrainian side. Therefore, Ukrainian special forces were able to blockade Storozheva from the north and northeast directions. The Russian special forces, on the other hand, began to withdraw towards the central front lines of the city of Storozheva and continued their defense mission in this area. But with the Ukrainian army support of the 68th Jaeger Brigade, the 108th Defense Brigade, and the 128th Territorial Defense Brigade, Russian special forces and other infantry units in Storozheva came under massive fire. After several hours of clashes, Ukrainian special forces managed to completely repulse the Russians in Storozheva and capture the city. Finally, the great offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces achieved a critical success and liberated this occupied city from the Russians. This striking progress was also very morale-boosting for the Ukrainian forces in Orikhiv, and the fierce attacks of the Ukrainians in the city of Orikhiv continued at full speed. The capture of Storozheva by the Ukrainian forces will put a strain on Russia, both in Orikhiv and Volodar, because the distance between Orikhiv and Storozheva is about 90 kilometers. Ukrainians will create a great attack corridor between these two cities. Currently, the repressive attacks by Ukrainian forces continue in this critical area range. On the other hand, there is a distance of approximately 42 kilometers between Storozheva and Volodar, and the Ukrainians are currently continuing critical offensive operations in Volodar as well. In the city of Volodar, the 109th Regional Brigade of the Ukrainian Army conducts artillery strikes to destroy the Russian fortifications, ammunition depots, and command centers. In other words, when we consider all these details, the capture of Storozheva by the Ukrainian army will act as a bridge between Donetsk and Zaporizhia for the great offensive plans of Kiev. In addition, the Ukrainians continued to use the successful advances they had made in Zaporizhia on the southern front lines. This situation was already inevitable, with the Ukrainian troops becoming noticeably more active in the south of Zaporizhia. In a way, the offensive operations of the Ukrainian army in and around Zaporizhia have been going on for a few weeks. Ukraine is conducting preparatory operations, launching artillery and missile attacks on important Russian logistics facilities far behind the front lines. The Russians had begun to retreat even more as small detachments of lightly armored Ukrainian troops advanced through open spaces towards Russian strongholds in the south of Ukraine, southeast of Zaporizhia. Because after such actions of the Ukrainians, the main offensive operation usually takes place. So the Russians don't want to suffer any more losses. Putin's troops are forced to rely on the defensive fortifications they have built along the southern front lines of Ukraine. But now no part of Ukrainian territory is safe for Russian troops. However, the Zaporizhia Oblast is expected to be crucial in Kyiv's efforts to repulse Russian forces, as its southern region serves as a land bridge between Crimea and mainland Russia. The Ukrainian forces seem to have a critical purpose after capturing the city of Storozhev and still maintaining their pressure in Orikhiv. After taking control of these two cities, the Ukrainians are trying to cross the Zaporizhia region and take control of the southern front lines. This is clearly evident from the support provided to the Ukrainian army by the Ukrainian partisans and volunteer units in Tokmak and Melitopol. So the Ukrainians may be trying to advance towards the Sea of Azov, which will divide the Russian forces into two separate groups. If the Ukrainian armed forces achieve this goal, the Russian forces will be completely cut off from Crimea. Also, this possible fiasco will be a nightmare for the Kremlin and Russian President Vladimir Putin. So are the successes of the Ukrainian army on the southern front lines such as Zaporizhia, Melitopol, and Tokmak enough for Crimea to come under the control of Kyiv again? The Russians actually clearly define their red lines. There has been talk of the use of nuclear weapons if the anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive begins in earnest, and if it appears to seriously threaten Russia's dominance in the strategically vital Crimean Peninsula. Russia has been giving signs of this very often, especially recently. When we look at the current situation, we see that the successes of the Ukrainians on the southern front lines affected Crimea. The critical successes of the Ukrainians in major offensive operations are now giving rise to sensational indications that the Russians are losing the war. But still, Moscow has not resorted to nuclear weapons because it was cornered. If Moscow doesn't believe it's losing, then we can calm down fears of an imminent nuclear war in the West. However, the fact that the German Leopard 2 main battle tanks and the US Bradley armored vehicles in the Ukrainian army's inventory are moving like a storm on the southern front lines may lead Moscow to much more despair in the coming days. On the other hand, another critical situation on the southern front lines greatly limits the operational capability of the Russian troops and puts Moscow in a much more helpless position. As you know, with the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam, the Russian positions were underwater for a certain period of time. The Russians were therefore unable to carry out an offensive operation against the Ukrainian southern front lines. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, used their advantageous position very well and managed to corner the Russians in Zaporizhia despite the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam. While this situation is beneficial for Ukraine, it seems that the Russians will suffer much more from the collapse of the dam. So whoever demolished the Kakhovka Dam, one thing is for sure. Its destruction means that the Russians will not be able to invade Ukraine's Odessa region. In summary, all these critical news are signs that are leading the Ukrainian army towards a decisive victory. However, when the Ukrainians will achieve a decisive victory is not known. Ukraine drew a line on the ground, and that line is Bakhmut, a city that few say is strategically important. But tens of thousands have died fighting for it. It started more than 7 months ago, and is the longest war ever. Despite the high cost of lives, the battle for Bakhmut rages on. Even as Ukrainian and Russian leaders prepare for a war, they expect to expand and intensify as the weather warms up. Bakhmut has become the stronghold of the Eastern Front line. The Russian army has lost more than 30,000 soldiers here in recent months. These heavy defeats caused demoralization, distrust, and opposition to the existing order in the Russian commanders. The result is disastrous for the Russian army. Some of Vladimir Putin's troops are fleeing the front. Some refuse to fight, and the rest are abandoned by the commanders to their fate. Here, Russia's elite First Guards Tank Army and the 155th Marine Brigade from the Crimea almost disappeared after heavy defeats. The Russian generals abandoned these armies to their fate. Now, about 40,000 Russian troops in and around Bakhmut are fighting aimlessly, abandoned at their own fate. Is it worth fighting for Bakhmut, where thousands of soldiers were lost? Let's look for the answers to our questions by referring to the hot breaking points in Bakhmut. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky stated that he and his military leaders plan to maintain their presence in Bakhmut and hold the city as well, despite the ongoing Russian aggression in the city. Ukrainian forces face both regular Russian army forces and prisoners gathered by the Wagner Special Military Group and filling their trenches in droves. There were tense clashes between the two as a result of these conflicts. Casualties were, of course, inevitable, but neither the Russians nor the Ukrainian armies are releasing official casualty figures for Bakhmut or elsewhere. Although official casualties were not disclosed, the mostly abandoned city turned into a slaughterhouse. The Russian army has lost thousands of men in Bakhmut in recent weeks, but most of these men were private soldiers working for the conventional Wagner Group. A British diplomat said that for every kilometer of land captured around the city of Bakhmut, hundreds of Russian soldiers were killed. Western officials say 30,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the fighting for the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut since it began last summer. That's a huge loss of human life for a total terrestrial advance of about 25 kilometers. Having lost 30,000 Russian soldiers, Vladimir Putin left the remaining 40,000 soldiers to their fate. As we mentioned above, the majority of casualties in the Russian army were the Wagner Group. The Bakhmut struggle also brought to light the rifts between the Russian official army and the Wagner troops. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the belligerent boss of Russia's Wagner private military group, enjoys his role as an anti-establishment maverick. But there are growing signs that the Moscow establishment is now holding him back, and he is out of breath. Prigozhin bet on his mercenaries waving the Russian flag in the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. But this came at a significant cost to the ranks of his forces and possibly his own fortune. The Wagner boss spent a lot of money recruiting as many as 40,000 prisoners to join the war. But after months of crushing fighting and staggering losses, he struggles to replenish Wagner's ranks while accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense of trying to strangle his power. For weeks, Prigozhin and his commanders had complained of insufficient ammunition resources just as they were trying to besiege and take Bakhmut. Russia's military establishment uses Bakhmut to downsize Prigozhin or completely eliminate it as a political force. Blaming Prigozhin also helps the defense ministry deviate from its own failures, especially around Vuhledar in the south, where regular forces have suffered heavy losses. Prigozhin said that we need the army to protect the approach us. If they succeed, everything will be fine. Otherwise, Wagner will be surrounded inside Bakhmut with the Ukrainians. Neither appears to be available when Prigozhin most needed the support of regular Russian forces and a reliable flow of ammunition. Wagner made incremental gains around Bakhmut and now holds the eastern part of the city, but it doesn't seem to be able to build up enough force to drive the Ukrainian forces out of the rest of Bakhmut, and his warriors scatter as they advance beyond the city to the northwest and southwest. Also last year, Prigozhin's bravado and what could be described as a licensed underdog of Russian President Vladimir Putin enabled him to open Russia's prisons and promote Wagner as a vital part of Russia's war machine. At the same time, he doubled down on his scathing critics, System of Shoigu and the generals for incompetence and corruption. He attacked the handling of the autumn mobilization days after Ukrainian forces humiliated the Russian army in Kharkiv. Last September, Prigozhin arrived at a Russian prison to shoot a recruiting video. At times, Prigozhin's criticisms were even sharper. He mocked Shoigu's son-in-law for living in Dubai during the new year. There were also signs of collusion with Russian ultranationalists who were equally critical of the campaign's conduct. But Shoigu, who has been defense minister for over a decade, is a shrewd operator. He devised changes to the high command that deprived Prigozhin of his allies and promoted generals whom Prigozhin criticized. Many analysts saw Shoigu behind the sudden announcement in February that Wagner was ending his prison service. Now the Wagner boss looks lonely. On the other hand, officials add that the epic nature of the war was so disproportionate to Bakhmut's strategic importance. But after more than 6 months of overwhelming, gruesome fighting, Bakhmut's future remains uncertain. Ukrainian forces are outgunned and outnumbered on a limestone slope to the south. There is an anti-tank group from the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade. Ukrainian troops dug trenches deep into the ground. The wooden supports that support the roof tremble as Russian artillery descends at close range, and voles run along the duckboards. Conditions began to change along the 965-kilometer-long Eastern Front. 3 storms. Chalky bunker on the hill feels like a dryland compared to the surrounding area. An early spring has turned the hard winter ground into mud. This may be in favor of the defenders. For the past 2 months, Russian forces have advanced steadily, trying to encircle Bakhmut. The commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, General Oleksandr Kursky, stated that his forces will continue to resist. Ukraine is determined to resist for Bakhmut. However, as the war progresses and casualties increase, the Russian forces are trying to develop new tactics. For example, Russian forces usually send a group of 5 to the front line while these 5 soldiers are being eaten by the Ukrainian army. The Russian forces are locating the Ukrainian army. Russian forces then go around trying to surround the Ukrainian soldiers from behind. In addition, Russian forces are more effectively using unmanned aerial vehicles armed with grenades. Russian soldiers drop drone bombs on Ukrainian positions. The losses in the Russian army are increasing. Besides the losses, relations with Wagner are at a breaking point. However, Russia has no intention of withdrawing from Bakhmut. In fact, the Russian army, which is trying to hold on in Bakhmut, is trying to develop new tactics. So why do Russia and Ukraine fight so much for a small city? Let's explore this question a little bit. As a regional transport and logistics hub, Bakhmut will be useful to Russian forces, although how much of its infrastructure, however, remains intact. More importantly, it will provide a stepping stone for this progress to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, 2 of Russia's long-envied major cities in the Donetsk region. Both would be within easy range of the Russian artillery. Moscow needs to control both to complete the liberation of the Donetsk People's Republic. Also, for Russia, Bakhmut would be a morale-boosting wartime victory after a series of defeats last year. The loss of Bakhmut could be demoralizing for Ukraine, even if, as its allies say, it doesn't make much of a strategic difference. As a sign of Bakhmut's importance to Kiev, when Zelensky visited the United States in December, he presented the U.S. Congress with a battle flag signed by the city's defenders. According to Michael Kaufman, a Russian military expert at the U.S.-based Cannes think tank holding the city helps maintain support from Western nations and is proving that it makes a difference if the city fell. Ukraine could be relieved by the fact that it held Russian forces for so long and paid such a high price for Bakhmut. This suggests that Russia's attempt to take moral end would be similarly costly. In short, as winter turns to spring in 21st century Europe, this is how war is waged for Bakhmut. A 19th century weapon still slays men in Black Ukraine. While the relentless war between Russian and Ukrainian forces on the Eastern Front continues, the Ukrainian forces are trying to make moves to change the course of the war. The high performance of the Ukrainian forces was a great source of morale and enabled the Ukrainian forces to make more forward-looking moves. Ukrainian forces carried out intense attacks on Russian support points throughout the war. The location of these support points could not prevent the Ukrainian forces. An attack carried out the other day also showed us how determined the Ukrainian forces are to take advantage and what kind of Russian military elements they are targeting. Let's take a closer look at these very strategic attacks by the Ukrainian forces and the war strategy of the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces accelerated their attacks on Russian military elements and facilities supporting the Russian occupation of Ukraine on the territory of the Russian Federation. Russian forces have an undeniable advantage over Ukrainian forces. However, the Ukrainian forces carry out very strategic attacks so that the Russians cannot use this advantage in an attack that took place the other day. Ukrainian forces inflicted great damage on the air power of the Russian forces. An explosion occurred near the airport in the Russian city of Yeysk. Yeysk Air Base is 460 kilometers away from the Ukrainian southern fronts. There was also an explosion and a fire at a Russian flight school base in the Krasnodar region. Subsequently, an explosion and fire were reported at the oil depot in the Krasnodar to support 580 kilometers from the front. After a very violent explosion at the Yeysk Air Base, a major fire was reported at the training ground. Although the news about the explosion and fire was denied by the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations, it was seen in the images that the fire continued for a long time, and many emergency teams were sent to the region. At the airport in the city of Yeysk, there were Su-34 fighter bombers, the most important weapon of the Russian Air Force. However, the fate of these 6 aircraft is currently unknown. It is very likely that 6 Su-34 fighter bombers were badly damaged and rendered unusable by explosion and fire. For the time being, we can qualify these planes as missing. Yeysk residents shared on social media platforms the evidence of explosions and fires in the Yeysk region. Although the explosions were proven by satellite images and civilians in the area, Yeysk Regional Governor Roman Bublik claimed that the fire broke out on a training ground where military exercises were held. Except for Governor Roman Bublik's statement, no official statement has been made yet. However, looking at the photographs, it is obvious that the military fire did not occur as a result of the military exercise. Although the Kremlin government and the Russian army refrained from making a statement on this issue, we can say with peace of mind that the explosion and fire were caused by the unmanned aerial vehicles of the Ukrainian forces. When we look at the geographical location of Yeysk, the Ukrainian forces have the capacity to carry out this attack. The Yeysk region gives Russian forces a significant advantage in the Azov Sea and occupied Mariupol. Yeysk is located 70 kilometers across the Sea of Azov from Mariupol, which is occupied by Russian forces. Yeysk Military Airport is only 200 kilometers from the Bakhmut district, where fierce fighting took place, and the airport has the power to support the invasion operations in Bakhmut, which has become the main focus of the Russian forces. Besides, Yeysk is located only 460 kilometers from the southern front line, which is one of the main focuses of the Ukrainian forces. This makes Yeysk an important target for Ukrainian forces. The region may seem distant when you look at the numbers, however. Ukrainian forces have also carried out drone strikes to more distant points in recent days. A series of incidents and explosions occurred in various spots of Russia that appeared to be related to drone threats. On the same day, many explosions occurred in the depths of Russia due to an unmanned aerial vehicle attack. These attacks are thought to have taken place from surprisingly remote location. Let's take a closer look at the attacks on the military installations deep in Russia, which have become recurring targets for Ukrainian drone attacks. Krasnodar is one of the regions most exposed to drone attacks by Ukrainian forces. Krasnodar is of strategic importance for the Russian invasion plan. At the same time, its proximity to the Crimean and Eastern Ukraine fronts and being an important support point for Russian forces made Krasnodar a key target for Ukrainian forces. Very close to the explosion in Yeysk, an explosion and fire broke out at a flight school base located near the city of Krasnodar. As always, the Kremlin government and military declined to comment on the explosion. Russian authorities have yet to confirm whether there were any casualties or equipment damage. As a result of our research, we found that the flight school that was exposed to the explosion was in the city of Adigia, south of Krasnodar. The flight school is almost twice as far as Yeysk Airport. From the points just mentioned, it is located approximately 460 kilometers from the Bakhmut region and 630 kilometers from the Kherson region. Another attack, which was carried out at the same time as the Adigia flight school, was carried out at a distance from other attacks. An explosion and fire broke out at an oil depot in the Krasnodar territory. The biggest feature in targeting this oil depot is that it both supported the Russian forces in the Ukraine invasion plan and was linked to one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's close friends, Igor Sechin. Igor Sechin is also the former deputy prime minister of Russia. Returning to the details of the incident, the infrastructure of the oil depot belonging to the Rosneft company was damaged as a result of the drone attack. The exact number of drones that took part in the attack on the oil depot was not disclosed. But judging by the photos of the locals, the attack had extremely serious consequences for the oil storage base. Based on photos taken by local residents, it was determined that the fire that started after the explosion was quite strong. Its consequences could not be eliminated for quite some time, and fire and a huge pillar of smoke could be observed from a distance of several kilometers. Emergency crews who came to the area had difficulty in getting the fire under control. Extinguishing works continued for a long time. The point of the attack is quite far from Bakhmut and Kherson. The fact that the Ukrainian forces are launching drone strikes at such great distances indicates that the Ukrainians are willing to end the war very quickly. The Russian Ministry of Defense made a single statement about all these explosions. The Ministry of Defense noted that the Kiev regime is trying to use UAVs to attack civilian infrastructure targets in the Krasnodar region and the Republic of Adygea by trying to portray targets used as military facilities as civilian facilities. The Russian Defense Ministry wants to distort the event as Ukrainian forces committed war crimes. However, when the targets are examined, it is seen that there are points used as military facilities. Well, what kind of advantage will these attacks give the Ukrainian forces? As we all know, Ukrainian forces are preparing for a multi-pronged counterattack in this process. Ukraine has two goals. The first of these targets is the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula is the point that will ignite the collapse of the Russian Federation. With the return of Crimea to Ukrainian control, the credibility of the Kremlin government will be shaken, and it will be difficult to focus on occupation operations in eastern Ukraine. For this reason, Ukrainian forces have given priority to Crimea. After the Crimea is taken, Donetsk and Luhansk regions will be cleared without losing speed. While the Ukrainian forces are advancing towards this goal, they must also eliminate the advantage Mariupol has given to the Russian forces. Mariupol was largely devastated early in the war, but it's still important to Russia because it's the largest city Russia captured and currently controls in 2022 and is also on a crucial supply route. Ukrainian forces continue their attacks in this direction before launching drone strikes in and around Krasnodar. Ukrainian forces attacked several strategic points in Mariupol. Among the targets exposed to the attacks of the Ukrainian forces are a steel factory used by Russia as a military base, 2 fuel depots, and an arsenal in an airport. Ukrainian forces are advancing very systematically to the great victory.